Hello everyone, Fred here. In this installment of TPP Dynamite, I'm going to be reviewing episode 9 of She-Hulk Attorney at Law. Whose show is this? The big series finale. First things first though, if you haven't already, let me encourage you to subscribe to my channel. In addition to reviewing films, books, and TV series, I'm an author of adult and young adult mystery novels. To date, I've released 3 books: The Women in White, The Lethal List, and most recently, Textbook Murder. All of them are on sale now, and there are purchase links in my video description below. With that in mind, and without further ado, welcome to my spoiler-filled review of She-Hulk Attorney at Law's Episode 9. Whose show is this? A 1970s-style commercialized introduction for the She-Hulk show depicts Jen in basically the same dramatic grind as the Incredible Hulk in the 1978 TV series, which I really did love. I thought it was a cool way to pay homage to what is, by my math, the only other existing live-action Hulk series. At any rate, Jen wakes up in a damage control Supermax prison, and it turns out that the whole intro was a dream. Nikki, Mallory Book, and Pug all come to visit her. Jen tells Mallory that she wants to build a case against Intelligentsia and prosecute them for how they ruined her at the gala by releasing her private information. Mallory, however, tells Jen that they need to focus on her case and that she's being charged for her behavior at the gala. Jen defends herself by saying that she was angry, and justifiably so, because of what the Intelligentsia did to her and how they released her private information at the end of last episode. Of course, it's at this point that I was thinking, but Jen, don't you remember? You're better than everybody at controlling your emotions just because you're a woman, and women are the world's most persecuted people group. This should be a walk in the park for you. Remember, you preached a whole condescending lecture to your cousin Bruce about it in the first episode. Anyway, Mallory tells Jen that her anger, righteous or not, has prejudiced people against her because people don't see a legitimately angered woman when they see her. All that they see is an out-of-control Hulk. Mallory tells Jen that she's managed to get an offer of a plea deal in which Jen will not be prosecuted for her actions at the gala if she wears a Hulk inhibitor device basically forever. The show is never really clear about how long Jen has to wear the inhibitor. And to me, that actually feels like a major overstep. Jen is basically getting the same deal as Abomination did in episode 2, and she did way less damage than Abomination has done. No one was hurt or killed in her rampage at the gala. She was justifiably angry, and the most that she did was destroy some property. Being locked to an inhibitor for frickin' ever seems like a punishment that really does not fit the crime, but oh well. This show has historically tried to portray Jen as basically the most righteous and the most unfairly persecuted person on the planet Earth just because she's a woman, so we'll just roll with it. Jen gets out of prison and she's consoled by her parents, but she's fired from her job, and it's unclear if this is because of her arrest, because of how she was ruined at the gala, because she can't be She-Hulk and go to work anymore, or for some other reason. Jen also loses her apartment and has to move back into her parents' house. Once again, I wish this could have been clarified a bit more. Jen has to have a massive savings account from her prior work for GLK&H, so she'd probably be able to afford her apartment. Is she being evicted because her landlord doesn't want the liability of an angry She-Hulk, or what? I mean, again, the episode is never really clear about it. Jen nevertheless persists in pursuing Intelligentsia. She and Nikki basically make a board of information on the organization and reason that they need to deduce the identity of Hulk King. Jen still wants to just sue Intelligentsia. Nikki lets on that she wants to pursue a more violent brand of justice, but Jen eventually talks her down. Nikki sees that Dennis Bukowski is talking badly about Jen on live TV, which annoys Jen. Jen's mom, Elaine, comes in eventually and ends up showing Nikki an old video of Jen's twerking in college, which annoys Jen even more. Jen later sulks in her room about how she originally didn't want to be She-Hulk, but still doesn't feel good now about being physically prevented from being She-Hulk. She even goes so far as to break the fourth wall and ask the audience if this is the sort of torture that we wanted for her to experience. The narrator from her dream starts talking again, but Jen immediately stops him, saying that we aren't doing that sort of show. Let me just stop here and say that while I thought that the bit with Jen shutting down the narrator was pretty hilarious, by now I have really had just about enough of the She-Hulk writers' use of Jen as a mouthpiece to throw their own little pity party and call out audience members who don't like this show, or who call out the shallow and unimaginative ways in which Jen has been written up until now. Personally, I don't want Jen to be tortured, but I also just don't care about her at this point. She just hasn't earned that from me. Tatiana Maslany is an amazing actress, but the material that she's been given so far has just been so abysmal. And as far as I'm concerned, that's the fault of poor writing on the part of Jessica Gao's team, and not my own sadism or sexism or whatever. It's like the writers seem to realize that people don't like Jen or this show, but they also seem to think that the takeaway lesson is that the audience is the villain, because of course, they themselves, the writers, cannot have simply written a bad show. Just, yuck. Anyway, Jen texts both Bruce Banner and Emil Blonsky for help, only to have her text messages not be delivered. Later on, she decides to just go to visit Emil's retreat, Summer Twilights, for his advice, because he had basically given her a blank check to come and spend time there whenever she so desired, back when she visited in episode 7. Nikki, meanwhile, uploads the video of Jen's college twerking to the Intelligentsia website in order to become an established member. She later gets an invitation to attend an Intelligentsia meeting at a location that remains undisclosed to the viewer. Nikki then enlists Pug to infiltrate the meeting while she uses an earpiece to feed him misogynistic things to say so that he'll fit in with the group and get closer to figuring out Hulk King's identity. Jen arrives at Summer Twilights and sees Dirk Garthwaite again. While Jen is getting settled in, Pug runs into Todd Phelps, who, in this show's biggest eye-roll moment, reveals himself to be Hulk King, as well as the founder of Intelligentsia. Pug has a hard time fitting in with the misogynistic crowd of incels because he hates their entire mindset, but he soldiers on anyway for the sake of the mission. Jen tries to find Emil, and Dirk tells her that he's in a private event down at the barn. It is pretty obvious to the audience by this point that we're being set up for the twist that Intelligentsia is meeting at the barn and that Emil is going to address them, probably in abomination form. Also, I just want to comment for the second time in my past 3 She-Hulk reviews that I wonder why Dirk wouldn't just tell Jen about how he was formerly hired by Intelligentsia to steal her blood. It's unclear exactly how much he knew about Intelligentsia or the identity of the person or people who were paying him to attack Jen outside of her apartment, but he must have known something. And it's one of this show's many plot holes that he's now been friends with Jen for going on 3 episodes and hasn't even thought to tell her yet about why he was hired to attack her or warn her that she might still be in danger from the people who hired him. Anyway, surely enough, at the Intelligentsia party, Todd addresses the crowd and introduces a motivational speaker for the evening, just as Emil walks out to address the crowd as Abomination. Initially, I honestly thought that this was the payoff of a hypothesis that I had way back in episode 2, that Emil was secretly a villain and manipulating Jen in order to get himself out of prison and carry on with some evil plan or another. Of course, I was fairly new to the She-Hulk show back then, and this show hadn't yet established its now patented pattern of setting up interesting story concepts and then ruining the heck out of them by following through on them in the least imaginative ways possible. So while it would have made for an epic twist that Abomination was secretly this show's big bad, and the leader of intelligentsia, this show naturally decides to take the least interesting route. So Emil turns out to be completely unaware of intelligentsia's true agenda or how they treated Jin. He truly believes that he's just doing motivational speaking for a paying group that wanted to organize at his bar. He apparently just regularly violates his parole terms by turning into Abomination on the sly to do speeches at venues where people want him to talk to them in his Abomination form. Jin shows up in the barn and is naturally surprised to see Emil as Abomination, considering that she vouched for him to get him out on parole. Emil turns back into his human form and offers up a weak explanation for what he's doing. Then Pug comes to Jin and tells her that Todd is Hulk King. Todd goes on a cringy and tear-inducingly stupid rant about how Jin doesn't deserve her powers, how she stole them from the Hulk, how he paid Josh to seduce her and take her blood, how he somehow got scientists to devise a way to make her blood safe enough to be transfused into other people so that they could get Hulk powers, and how all of this equals out to the fact that he earned the right to be a Hulk. He then pulls out a syringe full of serum and injects himself, turning into a Hulk and daring Jin to fight it. Randomly, Titania bursts into the barn wanting a rematch with Jin. Emil turns back into Abomination and actually tries to save Jin from the chaos by picking her up. For no reason whatsoever, Bruce bursts into the barn to help Jin. He thinks that Abomination is attacking her and he immediately starts attacking Abomination. Jin, meanwhile, just breaks the fourth wall to comment on how messy all of the plot lines on this show have become. The Disney Plus home screen pops up. Jin breaks her inhibitor and crashes through the home screen in She-Hulk form, having somehow gotten access to her costume and put it on. She then finds the Assembled documentary and climbs into it, appearing in the real world in the process. At Marvel Studios headquarters, She-Hulk storms into her own writer's room and confronts Jessica Gao and the rest of the She-Hulk writers who are in a meeting about their script. She basically derides the finale that they've written for her show, and when she finds out that the story can only be changed by someone named Kevin, she insists on going to speak with him. She-Hulk tears through security personnel and eventually finds a room in which all MCU projects are planned and produced by Kevin, which turns out to be a baseball cap wearing machine, not a person. Kevin, in fact, stands for Knowledge Enhanced Visual Interconnectivity Nexus. Before Kevin will let She-Hulk talk, he asks her to revert to her human form because of how expensive it is to create her for the screen. She-Hulk does it, then she tells Kevin how unhappy she is with her story. Kevin tells her that it isn't her story, but she insists that it's a legal comedy and that she wants to make her closing argument. Jin tells Kevin that her finale is too crowded with too many confusing plot lines, that everything is being thrown at the audience in a huge climax, and that this isn't necessary for her story. Jin asks Kevin to erase the Todd blood transfusion plot from her story, as well as Hulk's surprise appearance and the nighttime setting of it all. She asks that Emil submit himself to punishment for turning back into Abomination when he promised that he wouldn't. She reprimands Kevin for the continued use of daddy issues plot lines in all of the MCU's projects. She asks that Daredevil be dropped back into her story because, quote unquote, a woman has needs. She asks Kevin when the X-Men are coming to the MCU, but Kevin refuses to answer that. Jin then starts shifting her focus to season 2 of her own show, but Kevin informs her that the glitch that enabled her to contact him directly has been fixed and that she'll never be able to do it again. With that, Jin goes on her way, but not before Kevin teases her about being in an upcoming big screen movie, only to later say that he was joking. She-Hulk jumps back into her own finale, where she approaches the now human Todd, who thinks that she's going to kill him. Jin, however, just gives Todd a knowing smile and tells him that she'll see him in court. Titania gets arrested, Daredevil literally drops from the skies to help Jen, but is quickly informed that he's too late. Emil takes responsibility for turning back into Abomination and submits to arrest. I find it very hypocritical on Jen's part here that she even wanted this, considering that she literally just ripped off her own inhibitor and became She-Hulk to intimidate her own writers and Kevin into giving her the story that she wanted. I really don't see the difference between what Jen did and what Emil did in this episode, but oh well. Jen is a woman and Emil is a guy, so it's okay for Jen to break the rules, but Emil needs to be punished for it. Also, brief aside here, is it really just that easy to get out of those inhibitors? Emil did it apparently with ease, and now Jen has done the same thing. Who makes these inhibitors? Why are they made so that it's so easy to get out of them? That seems really dangerous. Damage Control and the police basically have to take people like Abomination and She-Hulk at their word alone that they won't pose a threat to society once they're released under the inhibitor protocols. I digress. Matt later joins Jen and her family for a huge lunch outside of Jen's parents' home. Jen's dad, Morris, basically has the talk with Matt about his intentions regarding Jen, only for Jen to get embarrassed and insist to her family that Matt is only in Los Angeles for the week. Bruce shows up eventually, explaining that he's been away on Sakaar since he was seen flying away in that cruiser in episode 2. He then announces to everyone that he has a son, Scar. Over the next few days, Jen is cleared of all charges related to her rampage at the gala. She also brings a lawsuit against Todd and Intelligentsia. As she gets ready to enter court to litigate her case, a reporter catches her outside to talk with her. She says that she wants for this case to be a demonstration that she will come after people who break the law and harm others, and that she'll be coming both as Jen Walters and as She-Hulk. The proper episode ends here, but there's a post-credits follow-up featuring Emil back in prison. All of a sudden, a portal sprouts out of thin air and Wong shows up. Apparently, Emil has decided this time to take Wong up on his offer of freedom at Kamar-Taj. Emil chides Wong for taking his time in getting there, though Wong defends himself by saying that he was pulled into another show. Emil leaves with him but starts asking questions about Kamar-Taj's living policies and particularly whether or not they have Wi-Fi there. Which is kind of odd considering that Emil was reprimanding Jen in episode 7 about how having no phone service was a good thing because it enabled her to be at one with herself. The end. So here are my thoughts. Despite that there were enjoyable parts to this episode, most of which I covered during my recap itself, this was a fantastically bad episode, as well as the absolute worst way to end a season or a series that I have ever seen. In fact, the list of good things about this episode is so brief and the list of bad things so massive that I'm going to forego the usual good-bad breakdown from my She-Hulk episodic reviews and just dive right into the many levels of disappointment that this episode delivered. First, this episode really would have benefited from being stretched out to an hour's length or possibly even a bit longer. Several topics or issues that were brought up, especially at the beginning of the episode, probably would have benefited from it. The mechanics behind Jen's plea deal and the extreme nature of her punishment given the so-called crime that she committed, the way that she gets fired and evicted from her apartment and forced to move back in with her parents, the relative underuse of Mallory Book's character as well as Nikki's and Pug's for that matter, the issue of just how Todd managed to synthesize a stable Hulk serum from Jen's blood, the twist with Emil's regular Abomination transformations, how Hulk got back from Sakaar and knew where to find Jen, how frickin' Titania knew where to find Jen. I'm just gonna stop there because I trust that I've made my point. There were way too many plot lines for 30 minutes, basically, a 30-minute episode. I commented in my review for the 7th episode that I felt like this show was biting off more than it could chew within the remaining 2 episodes if it stuck to the half-hour format, and I was right. This episode should have been longer in order to give its own storylines room to breathe and wrap up organically. End of story. No pun intended. In my review of last episode, I commented that I enjoyed how dark and mature and subtle the ending was, with its tackling the double standards imposed on women and minorities when it comes in particular to expressing justified anger. Well, this episode wastes no time in undoing all of that. A different and better Marvel show, probably a show like AKA Jessica Jones, would have handled the fallout of Jen's actions from last episode with style and a bit more sober and soulful approach to the whole thing. This show opens with what basically amounts to 10 minutes of Jen's feeling sorry for herself, blaming others for her problems, and whining about how she doesn't deserve what happened to her because she was justifiably angry when she freaked out at the gala. It just felt cheap, and it felt hypocritical when you factor in Jen's condescending speech to Bruce in the first episode about how she's a guru at controlling her anger just because she's a woman. My point is that Jen has not earned the sort of sympathy that the show has been trying since episode 1 to say that she deserves. She was an arrogant, whiny Mary Sue then, and guess what? I'm sorry to say that she's an arrogant, whiny Mary Sue by the time that this episode's end credits roll. I've said it before, I've said it a billion times. Dennis Bukowski is the most annoying character in this show, and it's borderline unbearable every time that the She-Hulk writers include him in an episode just so that he can be used in their enduring war on the male gender as a stand-in for every toxic man on the face of the planet. In my review of last episode, I predicted that Todd might ultimately be revealed as a part of Intelligentsia and or as Hulk King himself. I am the sorriest to confirm that I was right about that. I've already discussed just how disappointed I am with the entire Intelligentsia plotline and how the writers have basically used it as a backdoor way to give the finger to fans who are critical of the show in any way. I've talked about how infuriating I've found it to be that She-Hulk has basically destroyed the cooler and way more interesting Intelligentsia group from the comic source material and turned it into an underwhelming rally of shallow-minded incels who are basically just jealous of She-Hulk because she's a powerful woman. I've talked about how disappointing an antagonist Todd is, given his lack of real characterization at any point in this show, and given the fact that he's basically just been written as a stereotypically racist, sexist, rich, entitled white guy who somehow believes that he's better or more deserving than Jen because he paid a guy to help him steal Jen's blood for his own use and to ruin Jen by publicly releasing her private information. But even beyond all of that, this episode's treatment of him is shot full of plot holes. How was he magically able to make Jen's blood quote-unquote safe? Why did he wait until this episode's climax, presumably weeks after her blood was stolen by Josh, to actually take the serum and become a Hulk? What was he waiting for? I'm really not seeing why Abomination needed to reappear in this episode, especially given the way that he reappeared. At first, it seemed like he was about to be revealed as the secret leader of Intelligentsia, which actually would have been a much better story than what we got. Then it turned out that he was just doing motivational speaking for Intelligentsia, but didn't even know that they were the bad guys. Then it turned out that he'd been secretly turning into Abomination for no reason whatsoever in order to please certain crowds that just wanted a monster to talk to them. Then he got into a fight with the Hulk over a misunderstanding about whether he was harming Jen. Then Jen literally edited him out of the story and put him back in prison. It was all just so maddeningly unnecessary. It was like the writers decided to use him one more time but forgot to decide on anything meaningful to do with it. Bruce was another unnecessary addition to this already messy episode. It really didn't make sense how Bruce just knew where to find Jen at the Summer Twilight's retreat. Jen herself commented on that when she removed him from the episode. Then he was later included just so that he could introduce his son to Jen's family and to the MCU. And honestly, that last part felt like yet another lazy attempt by the writers to have their cake and eat it too. They had Jen openly acknowledge how Bruce didn't need to be in this episode. Then they turned right around and reaped the benefits of using him and Scar for a cameo. And that decision was even more frustrating because of how unnecessary it was. This is the MCU. Teasers and tags have been included at random points for about 14 years now. Surely Scar could have been introduced in another Marvel project down the line and at a time that made more organic sense to another movie or TV show. Titania. Yet another unnecessary and nonsensical addition to this episode. It made negative sense how she tracked Jen down to Summer Twilight and why she decided that then, of all times, was the prime occasion for them to have yet another rematch. The entire plot line where Jen meets her own writers, meets Kevin, then rewrites her own story was definitely a unique way to end the season and possibly the series, considering that the show hasn't been renewed for season 2 yet. Going that way would have been a risky move for even the most creative of shows or movies, and I guess the people behind She-Hulk deserve some props for taking a gamble that most other shows or films probably wouldn't dream of trying. But that said, it was the worst move that the She-Hulk team possibly could have made under the circumstances. And by proxy, it turned both this episode and the She-Hulk series overall into the worst Marvel content since the beginning of the MCU. And mind you, when I use the word worst, I am including Iron Man 2, Thor: The Dark World, Thor: Love and Thunder, Iron Fist, and Inhumans in my consideration. And before any of you hit me with this, I'm going to beat you to it. Yes, I'm aware that the She-Hulk of the comics was known to regularly do these sorts of meta storylines. Yes, I'm aware that one issue of her own comic involved her kidnapping her own writer and trying to replace him with a better one. Yes, I am aware that this sort of meta episode is basically just the next step for a TV show in which the main character regularly speaks directly to the audience. Said and settled. The difference here, and why that sort of storytelling fails this episode and this series, is one of execution. We, the viewers, are told by Jen that her reason for confronting Kevin and altering the finale boils down to a desire by her to reclaim her own narrative, tell her own personal story about how she became a superhero lawyer, and conclude that story on her own terms. And sure, on the one hand, I guess there's beauty in the whole idea of a woman who has literally been controlled by a machine since day one and who reclaims her own power. And you know what? Jen was right. There is something of a tired formula when it comes to Disney Plus TV shows and Marvel movies. And sure, it probably should have been switched up by now. But on the other hand, while you're watching this episode, you literally want to scream at this show's writers and so-called creatives that you cannot have your cake and eat it too. Since the first episode, this show has been building towards a major legal and physical showdown between She-Hulk and the Intelligentsia. It has been building to a possible rematch between Abomination and the Hulk. It has been building to a rivalry between She-Hulk and Titania. It has been building to a fight between She-Hulk and the Hulked out Todd, and so on. Formula or not, that is the story into which we, the viewers, have been asked to invest for the past 2 months now. So doing a bait and switch in the 11th hour, jokingly acknowledging that the whole formula is garbage, then pulling out without paying any of it off in any meaningful way, is the ultimate betrayal of the audience's trust. It is the ultimate screw you to the people who sunk money on a Disney Plus subscription so that they could keep track of this story as it unfolded. Again, the desire to flip the script on the kind of formula that seems to dominate Marvel Disney Plus shows right now is actually a very good and a very inspired idea. But if She-Hulk wanted to do it, it's something that the show should have done from the beginning versus at the end, after the audience has already spent 8 episodes investing in the exact opposite kind of story. This episode truly could have been pretty good if it had just maintained the momentum that was established in the previous 2 episodes and maybe built upon it. As things stand, we were basically subjected to a 9-episode cop-out, and I personally feel like we were robbed of the exact sort of action-packed finale that we were promised. The cynic in me is forced to consider the possibility that the reason why we didn't get that finale was just that the She-Hulk writers didn't have the budget to pull it off and were trying to cover themselves by giving us a finale based less around CGI and more around talking. The cynic in me is also forced to wonder if the She-Hulk writers just didn't want to expend the time or effort into effectively tying off all of the plot threads that it tossed out in the previous 2 episodes. Because of course, it's easier to make a mess than it is to clean one up. Then comes the fact that all of the self-referential Marvel TV and movie humor that was seeded into Jen's conversation with Kevin just felt cheap to me. This episode uses that humor to explicitly acknowledge the crappy writing on She-Hulk, the crappy CGI and the even crappier budget for it, the unnecessary inclusion of pointless characters and storylines, the lackluster Marvel TV and film formula, many of Marvel's worst TV and film tropes, and the generally frustrating way in which Jen has been written this entire season. But on the other hand, acknowledging that there is a problem does not make up for the fact that there is one. Bad writing is bad writing, no matter whether the writers admit to it. A poor story is a poor story, regardless of whether the writers acknowledge it as such. Joking on the MCU's worst tropes is no substitute for doing something about them. Truth be told, it actually felt to me like the snarking on Marvel's other movies and TV series almost served retroactively to hurt them, basically turning many of their more powerful story beats and plot lines into fodder for cheap humor. Finally, the use of the Kevin twist really does screw up the entire MCU, possibly forever, really. Whenever TV shows introduce the quote-unquote real world and reference themselves as nothing but made-up stories, those kinds of twists rarely work out well. Mainly because they tend to take away from the gravity of the characters' journeys once the shows announce to the audience that it's a fantasy made up by corporate overlords and that the stakes are essentially meaningless. And She-Hulk is no different. From now on, whenever I watch an MCU project, an idea in at least the back of my mind will be, but that person's story doesn't even matter. It's just a nonsensical formula cranked out of Kevin's computerized brain. Now yes, I get that the TV show Loki did a similar thing with having Loki discover the multiverse and the manipulation by He Who Remains. And for the record, while we're on that subject, I was not the biggest fan of that twist either. But I do think that Loki's approach came with way more respect for the stakes and the gravity of the twist than She-Hulk's approach did with its silly jokes and put-downs of basically the entire MCU as presently established. Also, before the woke mob tears into me over being unfair to She-Hulk about this, yes, I get that Deadpool tends to basically do the same sorts of things that She-Hulk did with this episode, but the difference between She-Hulk and Deadpool is, simply put, that even Deadpool knows not to cross the line. Deadpool pokes fun at itself and the real world and infamous tropes and twists used in comic book, film, and TV projects, but Deadpool's jokes never come off as ostentatious. They don't overstay their welcome. They're not used as an excuse to forego paying off Deadpool's own established storylines. And most importantly, Deadpool, at least the movies, seem to exist in their own separate and undefined universe where they can play by their own rules with no real consequences. Sure, Deadpool is officially part of the MCU now, but when those first two movies were being made, they were able to play around with the loose continuity between the various Fox mutant movies and shows, so the fourth wall breaking and self-referential snark didn't feel like they were a part of an interconnected universe that largely took its own logic seriously. And you know what? Maybe She-Hulk should have more closely followed the lead of something like the Deadpool movies. Maybe She-Hulk shouldn't have been set in the MCU but kept separate. Maybe it should have been placed in its own continuity where it wouldn't be tasked with telling a story that advanced the MCU while also making fun of the MCU and calling the MCU's very existential logic into question. Maybe the finale would have been better and the show more successful if it had done that. In my review of She-Hulk's last episode, I said that I liked how the episode treated Daredevil with respect, how he was never treated like a joke, how I really felt like only 1 or 2 or 3 real mistakes were made with his portrayal. Well, this episode's inclusion of Daredevil basically undid all of what last week's episode got right. The repeated jokes by Jen about hooking up with him were just so out of hand and so over the top. The new red and gold costume is still awful in my opinion, and it looks so much worse in daylight, and that was the only place where it was featured in this episode. The way that Daredevil was literally just dropped into this episode's story made no sense, and neither did the fact that Titania apparently knows him now. I also don't see why he needed to be included at the lunch with Jen's family at the end of the episode. It's not like he knows Jen that well by now. Of course, now that Bruce Banner has seen him there, I guess it gives the writers of future Avengers movies the out to say that Bruce now knows that Matt is Daredevil, that he found out off screen, meaning that he could possibly be inducted into the new Avengers whenever they might need it. It's a clever little storytelling trick, but I still don't like it. Given the rich history that we got with Netflix's Daredevil, I really would have preferred it if there had been more ceremony and nuance when it came to Matt Murdock's introduction to the Avengers. All told, I honestly think that Daredevil should have just been kept as a one-off and left out of this episode entirely. His appearance last time worked well enough. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. But this time, this episode, he didn't add anything to the episode outside of a dubious meeting with Bruce Banner that might foreshadow his eventual inclusion in the Avengers. Meanwhile, the way that he was used undid all of last episode's success with him by basically turning him into one extended sex joke by Jen. Okay, down to brass tacks. She-Hulk Attorney at Law's finale gets some credit for taking a creative storytelling risk, but this episode ultimately invalidates and destroys almost all progress that the last 2 episodes made. This episode would have benefited from a longer runtime and more focus on wrapping up the show's many dangling plot threads instead of ignoring them. And because this episode doesn't have any of those things, it goes down as a unique but failed finale. I give She-Hulk Attorney at Law Episode 9, Whose Show Is This?, 1/2 a cronut out of 5. At any rate, tell me what you think in the comments below. If you like this video, don't forget to leave a like, click subscribe, and please ring that bell. So long.